I want to talk to you tonight about a moment that happens in almost every person's financial life, usually quietly, usually without fanfare, and I want to tell you that this one moment matters more than almost any raise you'll ever get, any bonus you'll ever receive, any lucky break you'll ever stumble into. Here's the moment. It's the day you stop asking how much money is coming in, and start asking, for the first time in your adult life, how much of it you're actually keeping. I call it the day you finally start keeping the money, and I want to spend tonight explaining why that single shift in attention, not in income, in attention, is the actual dividing line between the people who build real wealth and the people who earn a great deal of money over a lifetime and somehow end up with almost nothing to show for it. Now, I want to be careful here, because I know exactly what some of you are thinking. You're thinking, Jim, I already know I should save more. Everybody knows that. And you're right, everybody does know it. In the same vague way everybody knows they should exercise more or eat better. But knowing you should keep more money and actually building a system that keeps it are two entirely different things. And the gap between those two things is where almost everybody's financial life quietly leaks away, dollar by dollar, for decades, without ever once being noticed until it's far too late to do much about it. Here's the truth almost nobody wants to sit with. Income is not the thing that determines your wealth. I have met people earning what most would call ordinary, unremarkable salaries who retired with genuine financial security, and I have met people earning what most would call extraordinary incomes who are one bad month away from real trouble at every stage of their lives, no matter how much the number on their paycheck grew. The difference was never the income. The difference, every single time, was what happened to the money after it arrived, whether it was kept, deliberately, on purpose, through a system built for that exact task, or whether it simply passed through, absorbed by a lifestyle that expanded to meet it, dollar for dollar, no matter how large the number got. Let me put some real figures on this, because I want you to see exactly how this plays out over time. Say two people each earn $70,000 a year. One of them keeps 5% of every paycheck, without exception, moved automatically before it ever touches a checking account. The other keeps nothing extra, spending everything that arrives, the way the vast majority of working adults do without ever consciously deciding to. 5% of $70,000 is $3,500 a year. That doesn't sound like much on its own, does it? But invested modestly over 30 years, growing at a conservative long-term market average, that $3,500 a year compounds into a genuinely large sum, well over $300,000 by the time that person reaches retirement age, built entirely from a percentage most people would tell you they'd never even miss. The person who kept nothing extra, over that same 30 years, at that same $70,000 income, retires with essentially whatever Social Security provides and whatever, if anything, they managed to save in the final handful of years when retirement finally felt close enough to be frightening. Same income. Same 30 years. A difference of hundreds of thousands of dollars. And the entire cause of it was never the income at all. It was one decision, kept consistently, to actually keep a piece of what came in instead of letting all of it pass through. Why is keeping the money so much harder than earning it, when on paper it sounds like the easier half of the equation? Because of something I call lifestyle absorption, and I've watched it happen in my own life and in the lives of nearly everyone I've ever studied who struggled with this. The human mind, left to its own devices, treats available money as spendable money, almost instantly and almost invisibly. A raise arrives, and within a few months, without any single dramatic purchase to point to, the household spending has quietly risen to meet it. A bonus arrives, and it gets absorbed into a slightly nicer vacation, a slightly nicer car, a dozen small upgrades that each feel entirely reasonable in isolation and add up, in total, to the entire bonus disappearing without ever being deliberately spent on anything at all. This isn't a character flaw. It's simply how the mind behaves around available resources, unless a system exists specifically to intercept a portion of them before the mind ever gets the chance to treat them as spendable. That's the whole secret hiding inside the phrase keeping the money. It was never really about willpower at the moment of spending. It's about removing money from your own view before your mind ever has the opportunity to absorb it into a rising lifestyle. Let me tell you about a man I'll call Harlan, though I've changed the name because the lesson matters more than the man. Harlan worked as a regional sales manager, and over the 15 years I knew of his career, his income more than doubled, moving from a solid middle-class salary to a genuinely impressive one as he advanced. And yet, at every single stage of that 15 years, Harlan told me later, he felt exactly as financially stretched as he had at the very beginning. A bigger income arrived, a bigger house arrived not long after, a nicer car followed the bigger house, private school for the kids followed the nicer car, and at every single income level along the way, Harlan's monthly expenses rose to consume essentially all of it, leaving him, by his own account, with barely more breathing room at double the salary than he'd had at the original one. I met Harlan at a sales conference where I was invited to speak, and during a break he told me his situation with a kind of bewildered frustration that I've heard from dozens of people in his exact position over the years. He said, "Jim, I don't understand it. I make more than double what I made when I started this career, and I have less certainty about my financial future now than I did back then. I asked him one question. I said, Harlan, in the last 15 years, as your income doubled, what percentage of each raise did you actually keep, on purpose, before your lifestyle had a chance to see it? He sat with that question for a long moment, and then he said, honestly, Jim, I don't think I've ever kept a single raise. I think every single one of them got spent within about 6 months of arriving. I told Harlan about the idea I'm giving you tonight, and I gave him one very specific instruction, because vague advice about saving more rarely survives contact with a real life and a rising lifestyle already in motion. I told him, starting with your very next raise, whatever it turns out to be, I want you to keep half of it, automatically, moved into an account you don't see day to day, before it ever touches your regular spending money. Not all of it. I've found that people who try to keep the entire raise usually resent the sacrifice enough to abandon it within a year. Half. Let your lifestyle improve with the other half, genuinely, guilt-free, because you've earned that improvement. But the other half gets kept, automatically, permanently, before your mind ever gets the chance to treat it as spendable. Harlan's next raise came about 8 months later, a meaningful one tied to a promotion, and he did exactly what I told him. Half moved automatically into a separate account the same week the new salary took effect, before he'd even fully adjusted to the new number showing up in his checking account. He told me later that the strangest part was how quickly he stopped noticing the missing half was gone. Within 2 months, his sense of what felt normal had simply recalibrated around the smaller, take-home portion of the raise, the same way it had always recalibrated around whatever number he'd been given before, except this time, half of it was quietly compounding somewhere he genuinely didn't see day to day. Harlan kept that system running for every raise, every bonus, every unexpected windfall, for the better part of the following decade. He told me the sacrifice, which had felt significant and even a little frightening the first time, became almost invisible after the first year, simply because his lifestyle had learned to calibrate around the after-kept number instead of the full number, the same way Harlan's kept half never once got spent across an entire decade of raises and bonuses. The size of the initial kept amount matters far less than most people assume. What matters is whether the keeping continues, without exception, for long enough for the compounding to do the actual work. 10 years after that conversation at the sales conference, Harlan's kept portion alone, compounding quietly the entire time, had grown into a sum larger than his entire annual salary had been at the start of those 10 years, built from money he told me he genuinely, at this point, did not miss in the slightest. I want you to sit with what Harlan discovered, because it's the whole lesson wrapped into one sentence. The mechanism that had been working against him his entire career, the mind's automatic tendency to absorb whatever's available into a rising lifestyle, was never actually his enemy. It was simply a force, neutral in itself, that had been pointed in the wrong direction his entire life because nothing had ever intercepted a portion of the money before that force got to work on it. Once he built one simple system that removed half of every raise from view before his lifestyle could absorb it, the exact same psychological tendency that had kept him financially stretched for 15 years started working quietly in his favor instead, without requiring 1 ounce more willpower than he'd always had. Let me address an objection I know some of you are already forming, because I hear it nearly every time I give this particular talk. You're thinking, Jim, that's fine in theory, but my expenses are already tight. There's no 5%, let alone half a raise, sitting around waiting to be kept. And I want to take that seriously, because for some of you it's genuinely true right now, in this exact season of your life. But I want you to notice something Harlan's story actually proves, which is that the keeping doesn't have to start on your current income at all. It can start entirely on the next increase, the next raise, the next bonus, money you have never yet lived on and therefore will never miss the way you'd miss cutting into money you're already relying on today. That's precisely why I told Harlan to apply this to his next raise rather than his existing salary. You don't have to find money in a budget that's already stretched thin. You only have to intercept a portion of money that hasn't arrived yet, before your lifestyle ever learns to depend on the full amount. That single distinction is what makes this approach survivable even for people whose current finances feel genuinely tight, because it asks nothing of the dollars you're already living on, and everything of the dollars you haven't started spending yet. So let's talk about what this looks like for you, starting with your very next paycheck, raise, or bonus, because a lesson without a system attached to it is just an interesting thing you heard once. First, decide the percentage you're going to keep, and I want you to be honest about starting smaller than your pride wants to start. Harlan started at half of new raises specifically, not half of his existing income, precisely because that made the sacrifice survivable. If half of everything feels impossible right now given your current situation, start at 10% of your current income, moved automatically, and increase it with every future raise the same way Harlan did, rather than trying to overhaul your entire current lifestyle overnight, which almost never survives past the 3rd month. Second, make it automatic, without exception. The same way Harlan's transfer happened the same week his new salary took effect, before he'd had a single chance to see the larger number and adjust his spending around it. Any system that requires you to manually decide, each month, whether to keep the money, will eventually lose to a bad month, a tempting purchase, a moment of justified sounding exception, because willpower exercised repeatedly against an ongoing temptation eventually loses, every single time, to a system that removes the choice from view entirely. Third, let the rest of your income improve your life without guilt. This matters more than people expect. Harlan kept half of every raise, and enjoyed the other half completely, without the low-grade resentment that comes from feeling like you're depriving yourself entirely in service of some distant future self. A system that asks for everything usually gets abandoned. A system that asks for a defined, sustainable portion, while genuinely allowing the rest to be enjoyed, tends to survive for decades, which is exactly the length of time this particular strategy actually needs in order to work. Fourth, apply the same percentage to every future raise and bonus without exception, forever, the way Harlan did for the following decade. This is the step that turns a single good decision into a genuine system. One kept raise is a nice year. A decade of kept raises, compounding quietly the entire time, is the actual difference between retiring with genuine security and working past the age you wanted to. Here's something else worth noticing about this whole approach. Nobody around you can see what you're keeping. Harlan's neighbors saw the same house, the same car, the same life they'd always seen from him, and had no idea that for the entire second half of his career, half of every raise had been quietly disappearing into an account they never once heard mentioned. That invisibility is exactly the point. Wealth built through consistent keeping rarely looks impressive from the outside while it's being built, and that's precisely why almost nobody does it, because there's no visible reward along the way, only a compounding number in an account most people never talk about at dinner parties. Harlan told me once that the strangest moment of his entire financial life came at a neighborhood barbecue, listening to a friend who earned nearly what he earned complain about having nothing set aside for retirement, and realizing that from the outside, the two of them looked identical, same income bracket, same neighborhood, same kind of vacations. And the only real difference between them was a single automatic transfer neither of their neighbors had any way of knowing existed. And understand the compounding on this the same way you'd understand compounding on any investment, because it behaves identically. $3,500 a year, kept consistently instead of spent, becomes hundreds of thousands of dollars over 30 years, not because the individual amount was large, but because it was never once interrupted, the same way Harlan's kept half never once got spent across an entire decade of raises and bonuses. The size of the initial kept amount matters far less than most people assume. What matters is whether the keeping continues, without exception, for long enough for the compounding to do the actual work. So here's what I want you to do, starting with your very next paycheck. Decide the percentage you're going to keep, starting smaller than your pride wants to if you need to. Set up the automatic transfer this week, before your next paycheck arrives, so the money is kept before your lifestyle ever gets a chance to see it. Let the rest of your income improve your life without guilt. And apply that same percentage to every future raise and bonus, without exception, for as long as you're earning an income at all. Most of you are not going to do this. I've given this talk enough times to know exactly how it plays out. Most people will feel something tonight, maybe even open their banking app with real intention, and then close it again, telling themselves they'll set it up properly next week once things settle down, and things, as I've said for 40 years, never settle down on their own. That's their choice, and I understand the inertia of it, because an automatic system feels like a small, unglamorous thing to build compared to the size of the problem it's actually solving. But some of you are going to set up that transfer this week, at whatever percentage genuinely fits your life right now. And a few years from now, you and I are going to cross paths again, and you're going to tell me about the day you finally started keeping the money, and how quietly, almost invisibly, it changed everything that came after it. That's the whole message tonight, so don't let it slide past you the way you've let so many raises slide past you before. Income was never the thing that determined your wealth. What happens to the money after it arrives is the thing that determines your wealth, and that is a decision, not a talent, available to you starting with your very next paycheck. If tonight's message hit home, tell me in the comments what percentage you'd actually be willing to start keeping this week. I read every single one of them, and I promise you're far from the only one who's never once kept a raise on purpose. And if you want more of this kind of straight talk on what actually builds financial security instead of just talking about it, subscribe to Legacy Mindset, because this is exactly the work we do here every single week. Now go set up that transfer.